Okay, in this video we are going to be looking at the different parts of the IELTS speaking exam. Remember, the IELTS speaking exam has no difference between the academic and the general training. So this is going to apply to everybody, no matter whether you're doing the academic or the general training version of the exam. Okay, so let's start with the overview of the exam first. So basically, you just need to make sure that you speak as much as you can. And if you find yourself getting frustrated with mistakes, you have to just practice to keep on going, because if you find yourself hesitating, that's going to start affecting your first column. And you're going to see in the next video, we're going to be looking at the band descriptors of the speaking exam. And the first column looks at coherence and cohesion. No, sorry, not cohesion and coherence. It looks at fluency. And so the fluency bit, is what will be affected if you don't speak as much as you possibly can, and if you get frustrated with mistakes and you start getting hesitant when you speak. Okay, so part one is 5 minutes to the maximum. On average, it's around 4.5 minutes. So what an examiner will do, we'll get to the end of, say, the fourth or fifth question, see that he's still got about 20 seconds left, and realize it's not enough time to ask the question and then get a good response from you. So they usually move on after that. So the average examiner will look at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Not really worth asking us a fifth or sixth or seventh question after that. So the absolute maximum for part one is 5 minutes. Then part two is approximately 4 minutes. So there's 2 minutes of speaking, and there's 1 minute of preparation time before you start speaking. Then there's 2 minutes of speaking, and then you have a follow-up question after that, which is approximately only 30 seconds. And then they move on to part three. Part three, again, is very similar to part one in the way that it's organized. So it's a maximum of 5 minutes. If the examiner sees it's getting to 4 minutes 30 seconds, they have to make a decision. Do I want to ask one more question or not? If you are a candidate that speaks at length about a question, then probably at 4 minutes 30, they will stop the exam, and that will be the end of the exam. So the total is 14 minutes. And the minimum an exam is 11 minutes. So they will always try and push you to get to 11 minutes. Even if you're a type of candidate that hasn't practiced properly for the speaking exam, you might find yourself only answering very brief questions. They will always have extra questions to ask you to get you to 11 minutes. But obviously you don't want to be in that situation. You want to speak as much as you can. All right, let's go on to part one to be more specific. Okay, now part one is always about personal things. It's personal questions related to you and how you react in certain ways. And it is a good idea to talk about your feelings and emotions here. How do you feel about something? How do you react to something? How does it make you feel, basically? Now, these are the most common 3 questions that come at the beginning. The first one will be, do you work or do you study? If you chose work, it would be something like this. Why did you choose this job? If you chose study, why did you choose this subject to study? Okay, and then this one would be pretty much general for both of them. What kind of work would you like to do in the future? So whether you've answered work or study in the first question here, you'll still get something similar to what kind of work would you like to do in the future. Now notice these structures. What do you do? So this is asking the present simple. What do you do? I study. If you're talking about something that's temporary, I'm currently studying in Madrid, but usually I study in London, or something like that. Okay, so it would be talking about present situations. But now look at this one. Why did you choose this job, or why did you choose this subject? Past simple. So you need to be answering in the past simple when you get to this one here. And then look at this one. What kind of work would you like to do in the future? This is a bit more tricky. It's future, but it's also hypothetical. You can't be sure what's going to happen in the future. So you could, if you're a very advanced student, you could start using hypothetical things. One thing I would love to be able to do is, but you could also use just the future. I'm going to, or I plan to, or I'm probably going to answer this question here. Okay, so you're looking out for the grammar structures that are being used in the question, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. Now, the second part, so this usually takes about 2 minutes. Remember, you've got 5 minutes in total. Okay, so this is the first 2 minutes. Then they start moving on, the examiner will start moving on to these things here. So it can be all sorts of things as long as it can be made into personal questions. So for example, let's talk about music now. What type of music do you like to listen to? What music did you listen to as a child? Has your taste in music changed over the years? Okay, and so these type of questions, they're never going to be political, they're never going to be too deep. They are things that you can answer in a personal capacity. Getting around in this case means, you know, how do you travel from your home to your university or to your job, and things like that. And it can be all sorts of things. These are just a few of the many different things that can come up in part 1, personal questions. And here we've got, again, the grammar we need to look out for. Do you often? Present simple. Do you often go, let's say, do you often go to art galleries and look at paintings? To be honest with you, not really. I do enjoy looking at art, present simple, but I don't usually go to art galleries. Okay, present simple. This one here, when you were a child, did you? Okay, so past simple now. Did you, say for example, did you have a favorite toy that you like to play with? Okay, so when you were a child, did you have a favorite toy you liked to play with? Oh yes, I did. My favorite toy, in fact, was a small red fire engine, plastic fire engine that I used to scoot around the living room with. Okay, and then the last one, what do you plan to? This is talking about the future. There's lots of other ways to say this. What would you like to do in the future? Here it is. Would you like to? What do you plan to do? Again, this is future. So you need to look out for how to answer this question. And what we'll be looking at is paraphrasing in the third video of this course, where we'll try to avoid using paraphrasing. We'll try to avoid copying the same words and phrases and use paraphrasing to make it look or sound better to the examiner, to show off your higher level of English. So we're going to try not to use the same word plan to. We're just going to try and use a different word, like it could be, what do you plan to do? What do you plan to, let's say sleeping. What do you plan to do when you're next on holiday? Now let's say, for example, that's related to relaxing, maybe not sleeping, but relaxing. So what do you plan to do in your next holiday? Well, one thing I'm keen to try is a hot stone massage, and that will help me to relax and enjoy myself. Notice in that case I haven't used plan to, I've used keen to try. Okay, so we'll be looking at that in more detail in the third video of this series of training videos. Okay, so now let's go to part 2. Part 2 is where we talk about ourselves, but it's a monologue. Okay, so there's no one who's going to be asking you questions. You'll have one cue card. This is called a cue card, Q-U-E card. Okay, this thing that will be here. There'll be one cue card, and you need to speak for 2 minutes. Now I'll talk about that later. Usually the questions are related to these types. So what? They start with what, where, when, and often with who, whom, with whom. That's because there's a preposition with here. So anything after a preposition, who becomes with, adds an M to it. So with whom, to whom. And then again, here we got this. How did you feel? How did you react? What emotions did you have? These are usually the fourth part of, or the third in this case, 1, 2, 3, yes, the third part, 1, 2, 3, 4, sorry, the fourth part, I was right at the beginning, the fourth part of a question like this. So let's have a look at an example here. Describe an experience when you played an indoor game with others. Okay, an indoor game, maybe indoor football or chess or a computer game even. Okay, so when did it happen, what the game was, and who you played with, and then how much you enjoyed. Okay, and you need to go and speak for 2 minutes. Now, the examiner will say you have 1 to 2 minutes for speaking for this. Now, that's a problem, because what will happen is that if you get, for example, to 1 minute and 20 seconds and you say that's enough, the examiner is obliged, has to, look at you for about 4 or 5 seconds. Is there anything else you would like to say about that? Okay, so you've got 4 or 5 seconds of awkward silence, we say in English. Awkward silence is where people don't feel comfortable. Okay, and there's silence because you expect to be talking. And they'll just look at you for 4 or 5 seconds and then they'll ask you to try and speak some more. You don't want to get to that position, because that awkward silence can put you off, can make you feel uncomfortable, and you're going to be going into part 3, which is the most difficult part, and you've got that subconsciously, that awkward silence that you heard in your mind, and it's put you off. It's made you feel uncomfortable for the rest of the exam. So part 2 is very important, to speak until the examiner says, stop, bas, enough, thank you, khalas. Okay? He won't say that, but. Okay, so you are really going to give yourself problems if you don't speak for 2 minutes and beyond. At least get to the point where he says, okay, thank you, or she says, thank you very much. Okay, and we're going to be doing a lot of practice of part 2 in this course, so we'll come back to that. Okay, now let's have a look at part 3. Now this is where it's non-personal questions usually. Okay, so you notice when they're non-personal questions, they're talking about people in general, and they are broken down. I've studied part 3 questions quite extensively, and they're broken down into these 6 different categories. Okay, and they let's start with this one, hedging. Okay, hedging is where you say, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but from my experience, I think. Okay, so this is a question like, how do people in your country, right? And that's going to continue. How do people in your country usually do the weekly shopping? Okay, and it would be bad to say they all go to the supermarket, because that's not true. You cannot be sure that 100% of every person in your country goes to the supermarket. So what the examiner is looking for is your ability to hedge here. And you say, well, usually people go to the supermarket and they'll go and, push a trolley around and pick up stuff for themselves. Elderly people, however, rely more and more on online deliveries that bring the food to their house. And they tend to prefer that because it doesn't require them to get into a car or drive, or especially now with COVID situation, they don't want to expose themselves to the virus by going out and shopping. Okay, now you've used tend to, usually, often. Okay, and this question, it's a present simple question, but they're checking if you're able to hedge. Usually, tend to, most people do this for the most part. Okay. The second type is asking about hypothetical situations, and these use the words would, we'll add that one there, could, may be able to, if. Okay, so in what way might the government be able to? You're listening for this and you're saying the possibility of something in the future happening. You could be answering, like, let's say, in what way might the government be able to support elderly people when they go shopping? And you can say, well, one thing the government could do is, and that's a sort of, it's a possibility in a hypothetical situation. You can also use the phrase if the government provided free transport to and from a shop, that might help to support elderly people or something like that. Okay, so hypothetical we're looking for. Then the next one is, and hypothetical typically comes with if they could do this, it would. So future possibility and hypothetical situations are very closely related, in fact, and you'll see this. So how might the people change in the future? There's a chance that, there's a possibility that, we may well see. So how might the way people go shopping change in the future? Well, I think there's a very fair chance that big supermarkets will start to close down. They'll become more like warehouses, and people will simply go online, select stuff, and then that stuff will be brought to their house. I think that's very possible. And we may well see, here it is, we may well see that certain shops in fact completely close down and go bankrupt because of this. Okay, so hypothetical and future possibility are very related, closely related. Okay, now the next is giving reasons, often starting with why or in what way. Okay, and so here you could see that technically it's a mixture of hypothetical and giving reasons. Okay, but let's stick with this one with why. So why do you think many people believe that? Okay, and you're giving reasons. I think it's got to do with, I think it's because, this phrase, it means because. I think it's because. I think it's got to do with. So let's say, why do many people believe that, why do many people believe that shopping weekly is the best way to do their shopping? So doing a weekly shop is the best way. Well, I think it's got to do with time. People don't have time to go to the shop every day or every third day, so they prefer to do a big shop on, say, for example, the weekend or on a Monday evening or Monday afternoon, and anything that they need for that week is bought on that day. Okay, it boils down to, the main reason is, and what many people don't realize is, what many people don't know, the root of the problem is that, okay, and we can go on. So we're giving reasons in part 3 as well. Then we go on to alternatives. Now this one I find is probably the most difficult that I find with my candidates to do, because they have to think about, it's not just language related, this one. You need to actually start thinking about alternative ways of doing things. And if you've been doing the same thing the same way every year all your life, and suddenly somebody says, what's an alternative way of shopping? Okay, now it's not just language, it's okay, I've never actually thought about this. Okay, so this is where it's important, I think, especially with alternatives type questions, is to know how to do this. Okay, and that's it sort of delays your response. That's an interesting question. I never thought about that. Okay, so let's have a look at the question. Apart from shopping at supermarkets, are there any other ways that people can shop? Okay, now that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that much, because I've basically shopped at supermarkets all my life. But I suppose one way would be to go to the local market, and markets in my city are actually starting to undergo a revival. Most people didn't want to go to markets because they saw it as old style and traditional, but now these markets are starting to get more and more customers coming into them, etc. Okay, so you do need to have a little bit of chance for you to delay your response and give your brain a little bit of time to think, and that's in part 3. That's an interesting question. Okay, and this is the type of structure we can use to delay that a little bit, and it usually is needed in part 3, especially when I'm asked to give alternatives. And then finally we get to advice, also a little bit tricky, not only about English, but giving solid and valid responses to questions. So do you think the government should, let's say, subsidize certain products like milk? Subsidize means pay money from the taxes to make things like milk and flour cheaper for the average person. So do you think the government should subsidize basic goods like milk, sugar, and flour? And your advice would be, okay, well, again, that's something I haven't thought about much, but I think the idea of supporting certain industries through subsidization should be considered. And I think that, for example, the bread making industry could be provided with assistance, because bread is a staple diet in my country. I know that rice is a staple food stuff in, for example, China or Japan, but bread is very, very important in my country, Poland, or my country, usually in Europe. The most important food stuff is wheat based. Okay. All right. So that's part 3. And we'll be obviously doing a lot more practice of these different things as we go through this course. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.